stomachs are not very bad. The second issue was exchange rate. Exchange rate is also a composition of many things. It is a composition of fiscal policy and also monetary policy. But then they are all intertwined. That is why I am summarizing all of them together. Because the same sword, the same toolbox that you get tools to deal with exchange rate is the same tools that you use for monetary policy, and somehow also they are the same that you use for inflation. So, exchange rate, we looked at it fiscally in terms of balance of payment, and especially in the current account. If I become too jargonistic, you can tell me, but I can see we are all together. So, on the fiscal side, you deal with the current account, export imports. How are we to make our exports better? We haven't yet succeeded, but we are headed in that direction. So we tabulated what we import most. One of the things we import most, number one, is fuel, Yamagari na industries. Second highest import in the country is edible oils. Close to 150 billion shillings every year in edible oils. Hii mafuta wazee tunapikiwa nayo hapo jikoni, an aggregation of that, Kenya spends 150 billion every year to import that. So what were we to do then? Try to do import substitution. If you look at our budget previously and now, we are dealing with fiscal side inputs around edible oils. You will see sunflower there, you will see canola there, and anything else that assists Kenya in being at least close to self-sufficient in terms of edible oils. Then the last one, summarizing all the three markets. Now we were here, we wanted the shilling to gain. But on the other side, we also want inflation to come down. But on this other side, then you have interest rate to deal with. Now we have seen in the market, we have succeeded in bringing down inflation. We have also succeeded in strengthening our currency. But on the monetary side, then you see that our money is very expensive. Our interest rate is high. But why do that? It's because as economists, you know that you cannot be expansionary as an economy and contractionary at the same time. You can't eat your cake and have it. So you can't be expansionary here giving money through tax breaks and the rest, and at the same time, you are being contractionary. So, exchange rate, we had to raise interest rate. Why? As I said before, exchange rate is a component of two major things: the current account and the capital account. So the current account you sort through fiscal policy. But the capital account, you are dealing with net capital inflows. But what determines net capital inflows? It is CI minus CO. Capital inflow minus capital outflow. Then you are here as Kenya having money. It's here, Kenyan money is here. US has raised the Fed for 11 times consecutively to 5.52%, crossing to 5.5%. The Bank of England is here raising interest rates. All the other economies are raising interest rates. Kenya is part of the world or the globe where, to some extent, capital permeates. So you are here now as central bank. And one of the components that will make your currency strong is when you have demand for your local currencies and less demand for the other currencies. So that is the reason why the CBK had to raise our interest rate to where it is now. So that you with money in Kenya and you are looking for fixed income instruments, you do not need to go for a dollar fixed instrument. You can still invest in Kenya shillings, get the amount that is now available in our markets, and therefore protect outflow, even if you don't attract a lot of inflows. And that is the whole ecosystem around where our economy is. I'll talk very few points. I want to talk number 2 about budget, so that we close in. Budget, we are now in the budget making process in Kenya as we talk. In fact, the National Treasury just tabled the supplementary estimates 2 and the main budget for financial year 24-25. So let me talk about 24-25, because I would request, just Honorable Kehongi said, that we get, the more voices the better. The more Kenya becomes more open to many voices the better, and especially very considered opinions like of the people in this hall. No, now our budget policy statement, we had made ceilings to a tune of 4.1 trillion Kenya shillings. But in the estimates, we have revised that downwards. And our current budget that we are making is around 3.93 trillion Kenya shillings. 3.913 actually. And I want to go slowly here because this is our domain, people here. So 3.9 something, so we have climbed down. Even if I'm not very exact, it's because budget making process, you only become certain about figures when it is already approved by Parliament. But these are tentative figures which have been submitted by the National Treasury. Out of that, the revenue side of our budget, ordinary revenue that we anticipate to collect, as you know, budgets are projections. It's never certain, including household budgets. So 2.9 trillion ordinary revenue. A that we project to collect 441 billion Kenya shillings. A, you know what A is. Those who are in parastatals that collect money and you spend at source, that is A. The money you pay in a hospital, which is government, it becomes revenue for government, it's A. The money you pay for passports, that becomes revenue for government, is not part of ordinary revenue, but is A. That's 441 billion Kenya shillings. Grants will be around 51 billion. Now, I am proud about the other figure I'm to give. I'm very proud about it. If you look at our budget policy statement, we had projected to have a deficit of 703 to 720 thereabout billion, depending on which budget, the one submitted or the one that we ended up approving in terms of budget policy statement. Currently, we have revised that downwards, that our deficit in Kenya is only 5.14, is only 514 billion Kenya shillings. I'll highlight what that means and why I'm excited. Let me go to the revenues, to the expenditure side. And I bear that you become keen. You see clearly as economists where we must point our eyes. Our recurrent national government expenditure, recurrent in national government alone, is 1.6 trillion. Recurrent of national expenditure alone. Sijaweka governors. Recurrent national expenditure. Out of that, around half of that, is PE, personal emoluments. Salaries, in other words. Development in the current budget we are making, 730 billion. You already see now why I'm reading these figures. Development, 730 billion Kenya shillings. Monies to counties, shareable revenue, 391 billion. It is still contested. Governors are already also negotiating and will come to a conclusion, but tentatively now, we are dealing with 391 billion Kenya shillings. CFS, Consolidated Fund Services, 1.2 trillion. Can you just look at those figures as an economist before I proceed? Because I can see you writing. Just look at them. And especially look at what I've read in terms of the economy as an aggregation of households. And you are the household. And look at that budget. in a household setup. Just look at those figures, because they form part of the biggest basis of government policy, and especially economic-wise. So, look at the expenditure side. 1.6 trillion Kenya shillings recurrent. 730 billion development. Forget about the counties. CFS, 1.213 trillion. What is CFS? What is this thing we are calling CFS? It is 1.08 trillion going into payments of interest rates for the public debt. 1.08 trillion is going into the payments, not of principal, of interest rates, both domestic and external. Domestic, Kenyans will be pocketing over 750 billion Kenya shillings in interest paid by government. Domestic debt. So the other one part of CFS is pensions, which is, they form part of the first charge in budget making process, but also in release of exchequer. So when I'm doing the budget, the things I don't negotiate. First of all, I put CFS where it should be. Whether it comes rationalization, you don't touch. So you only touch what? Development. When you are rationalizing the budget, the sacrosanct number one, you can't touch CFS, because you have to pay your obligations and you have to pay pensions. The second thing that then we put safe is PE, salaries for the civil servants, because you can't start negotiating at economy haifanyi mzuri, ugoja kidogo. What becomes the casualty when you hear there is a fiscal consolidation? The casualty number one all the time is domestic development budget. All the time. Just look for the entire existence of budget making process in Kenya. So that aside, I know you have made some sense of these figures. Now, on the revenue side, I talked about deficit of 514. The reason I am excited, when we came in less than 2 years ago, if you look at the then budget, the deficit to GDP ratio in Kenya was around over 7%. 7%. In the budget policy statement, we estimated it at around 3.9% when it was over 700 billion. Now we are making a budget that Kenya has not seen for the last 15 years, where our deficit as a measure of GDP will only be 2.9%. Please clap for me. Lakini hii ya kuitisha ni balaa. So, and not me, of course, it is the entire everyone, all Kenyans together, because when you hear the deficit is down, something will pay for it. And that something will be development, definitely. Now, I don't know whether I'm making sense with all these jargons, because I could be talking to myself, because I think I'm too technical. Tuko sawa? Okay. Now, debt. We talk about debt all the time. Kenya, of course, is between 10 to 11 trillion. The reason why you can't say about debt with certainty, now in the markets, exchange rates is changing. So the debt in the morning is different from the debt in the evening. So it's around 10 to 11 trillion. The only thing I want to isolate there, because I was talking about debt, why can't we borrow? Because all the other growing economies borrow anyway. And we have empirical evidence to show that the US debt to GDP ratio is over 120%. That Japan is over 260%. And Kenya is below 70%. And especially by using the nominal GDP of 18 trillion. Why can't we borrow? Then Why can't we as economists then come up with a theory in a paper, those who are doing masters? Borrowing as a tool for economic growth. Why can't one of us then come up with that kind of a paper? And I'm giving my opinions. I am not an authority per se. These are my opinions. Japan. You know, unless the policy maker wants to borrow, they say big economies are borrowing. And they cite the US, the UK, and of course Japan comes in handy to justify. But you have refused to go that route. Why? Currently the US debt is over 32 trillion Kenya shillings, the US debt. But then in borrowing, number one, you look at the use. When you borrow, this money is going into doing what? Because if you are borrowing and the money cannot generate more money within the economy, then stop borrowing. And that's what we are precisely doing. Number two, you look at interest rate. Our domestic debt as a composition of the entire debt and the external debt is 50-50. So when you talk about 10 trillion debt, 5 trillion is domestic and 5 trillion, give or take, is foreign. Out of that, our major debt, which is foreign, is dollar denominated. So when you have a variation in currency, which you may not have a lot of control when you are in a floating exchange rate regime, then you are trying to borrow and jump into a hole where you don't know it is up to what depth. So that's one of the reasons why we cannot continue perpetuating over borrowing, because we don't have a lot of control over the gymnastics around exchange rate. Second, and maybe the last, because the rest you know, Japan. If you study the economy of Japan, since 1994, for 30 years, the GDP of Japan, in real terms, economics, you know you have real and nominal. If you deflate the Japanese economy, it has not grown in real terms for 30 years. But then, why am I saying that? How is it related? Japan has a 260% debt to GDP ratio. But why can't we compare ourselves with Japan? The major thing is this. Two, cost. Number one is cost. Number two is something I'll call net off. Cost. Do you know Japanese government does business with borrowing? Do you know part of how Japanese government raises money is the business that I'm talking about of debt? If you check, you can Google later. Before COVID, there is a time you could buy a 10-year bond, a Japanese 10-year bond at negative interest rate. Can you imagine? In Kenya now, we are talking about infrastructure bond of 18%. Japan, negative. That's one, cost. Second, net off. Can you do for me empirically how many countries Kenya has lent money? Kenya is a debtor, but is it a creditor? Or the other way around? Just tell me, because you are economists, how many countries has Kenya lent money? Anyone with an idea? Maybe silence means if you don't know. Look at Japan. When we are talking about the US having 32 trillion Kenya shillings in public debt, the number one external lender of the US government is Japan. But at what rate? Now you try to see. How much have they borrowed at? How much have they given the US at? That's the reason why comparing a thriving, growing economy to those in terms of borrowing, you only do it when you are lazy. So when you see me on TV one day justifying we are borrowing because Japan is borrowing, no, these guys have started to be lazy. Because there is no comparison. Let me come to the close by the last point. As we think now as economists, I'm just provoking ourselves. We have read many theories in economics. Mercantilist, we know them. That trading alone makes a lot of sense in economic growth. We have read about physiocrats. Physiocrats, they say, no. Agriculture is the main thing in economic growth. That the only productive sector in an economy is agriculture. Because the others, you only transform the factors. But then, why must we focus on as economists? This is my opinion. Looking at the US, the UK, the Asian tigers, one thing that we must continually improve in Kenya, in Africa, in all developing countries is capital accumulation. If you look at Kenya, how much capital is allocated to every Kenyan who is a worker? Look at Japan, for example. Look at Germany. Germany, you see capital per worker per person reached optimum many years ago. So the most they can do is to maintain, because there is no more growth to do in terms of capital per worker. If you look at all those economies, including China, when we talk about China in manufacturing, we are basically talking about accumulation of capital. Because the major component of manufacturing is capital itself. Because then you look at Kenya, for example. The reason why we are agrarian now is because our number one priority is not even to create quality jobs. Number one priority is to engage everyone. Because there are so many people without jobs. So when you're a policy maker, number one thing that you're doing is first of all to know, how do I engage as many Kenyans as possible? So the question of how am I engaging Kenyans becomes secondary. And I think then, as policy makers, we need to move in tandem. Because what would we rather have? Labor-intensive industries where everyone is employed with very low productivity, or then we have a sizable number of people unemployed, but those people who are working are optimally utilized. I don't need an answer. I'm just provoking our mind. The other thing, just a few things about what we are doing in government as I close. Poleni, nimechanganya vitu mingi because the topic is too wide. People are saying, no. You people, KICC, and all the other parastatals. Privatization, that's the one I'm talking about. I don't want to be explicit because I see cameras here. And I don't want to be misquoted. Now, as an economist, you are seated here. What is the role of government? From where I sit, if the government guarantees me security, guarantees me property rights, guarantees me enforcement of my rights, and gives me a conducive environment, my opinion, it should leave me alone from there. Because the interactions between private sector, between economic agents, make much more sense than the government offering services. Now, Kenya has over 300 institutions. Some are commercial in nature. When government comes in, when we are in economic classes, we say one of the reasons for market failure is public goods. How is banking a public good? That the government of Kenya owns a bank. How many people here, I can say it because it's public, how many people have an account in Consolidated Bank of Kenya? Do you know? Now, let me also say this. How many of you who your grandmother has ever boarded a plane? I'm not even asking about, of course, many of us flew here. Now, do you know why I'm asking that? The tax my grandmother pays in the village as VAT. Can you imagine? Over 40 billion of that in a year goes into building KQ. My grandmother pays rent, pays tax as VAT in even salt, so to say. It bills you to come to Mombasa through KQ. So what am I asking? Why is the government engaging in areas where private sector is already doing so well? And in sectors that are already so profitable, you find government institutions doing so badly. Look at banking sector in Kenya. It has been growing every year. Look at the government institutions within that banking sector. Look at how they perform. And you can't cite KCB because KCB is very different. It is run as a private sector. So all these things we are doing because government to be efficient must be lean. And the reason why we want to dispose of all these things by way of either leasing, some even selling through IPOs, and others, of course, through other methods, is because we cannot continue now talking about the budget I read here to you, and the deficit you are taking, borrowing, is coming to bail out a company that is not strategic in nature in terms of governance. And that is the reason why we are doing what we are doing. Very lastly, this is not economic, but maybe it's Turkish, not economists. Kenya, we are here as Kenyans now. What do we do mostly? You get a tender, you get employed, immediately here, all of us have plots. All. If you don't have, you already have a lot of buying a plot. I am sure. You know why I'm very excited about housing program that the president is leading? If you look at Kenya, we have had a distortion. When my sister is a teacher, when she retires, kujenga nyumba flat. When you retire here, your biggest insurance when you retire here, I am sure, you are building a flat already. Already. The reason why I'm very excited about the housing program, it will make us focus our capital elsewhere. If all the money we put into building flats every year, that money went to buying this machinery and the other one and the other one, the capital per worker I talked about increases. Kenya definitely grows at a much higher rate than the one we would grow by building flats. Second, you have a plot in Ruto and another one in your hometown. You've also bought a plot, Pare Busia. You have a plot in Kilifi, those who come from here, and you call your uncle, your mother, and itaftie kaploti. We all buying plots here. Now, when you are doing profit loss, and you are doing asset and liabilities, for you, not for the country, those plots you end up buying, where do you put them? As assets or liabilities? Some of you have 8 plots, 3, 4, 5. Now, this plot when you buy, and you have a plot of 100 by 100 somewhere, what comes to you as the owner of the plot? One is security for the plot. Usiende upate mchanga imemwagwa hapo ama lori ya kakoto. So what do you do immediately? You're bringing somebody to look after your plot. Then the other one you have in Kisumu Dala. You also take another person to look after your plot. So when you do your monthly revenues for a business you have somewhere for the salary, what is the outflow? Yes, food, school fees. The other outflows, plot ya Mombasa nalipa caretaker, plot ya Kisumu Dala nalipa caretaker. So is that an asset or liability? Food for thought. Please, as we move out of here, this is my own opinion. I've been in the stock market for some time, which you know. It's I don't need to hide because I also don't like hiding under proxy accounts and the rest. As an economist who has gone and done predictions in class, because we work with predictions, time series data and such. When you look at Kenya now, those who have been investing in fixed income instruments like treasury bonds and bills, and also who've been investing in infrastructure bonds, I want you to go and think, is that trade likely to continue on an upward trend? Are we likely to buy infrastructure bond at 20% or actually lower than you bought last month? What am I trying to say? When the economy grows like this, interest rates are going up, they can only start going down. And I can guarantee it's very unlikely that the